Right, hello everybody. Just get myself lined up with my camera. My name's Claire Collins. I'm head of consultancy at NGA, and I'm here today to talk to you about governance, safeguarding, and the pandemic. Those of you who have done one of our webinars before, you'll find in that little menu box on the side of your screen, that's if you haven't reduced it, press the orange arrow to reduce it. There's a chat line in there. And so if you've got any questions that come up, pop them in there and I'll do my best to answer them. If not during the session, which might not be possible, I would try and get back to you if there's anything which I feel hasn't been covered in the session afterwards. But let's get going because there's actually quite a lot to say. And this half an hour is going to disappear quite rapidly. Right, let's go. So my aim this session is just to give a sort of an overview of what the board's responsibilities are for safeguarding, with this particular focus on the pandemic. And you'll be able to see there the sort of 5 areas which I'm intending to sort of skate over. This is not an in-depth session. It's not one of our 2-hour training sessions, but I hope that it will raise some issues. And for those of you who are familiar with safeguarding, it might just act as a refresher and a new perspective. But start off with, I've got a poll. You can't see, but in the background, my colleague Molly is with us. Molly is the calm behind the delivery of this webinar. Molly, can you launch poll 1? This is just to ask those of you who are here now, what is your role in terms of safeguarding? So if you could just complete that. And Molly, can you, when you can see that most people have managed to tick the box, can you close it so that we can share it? I can't actually see the poll. So, are we nearly there, Molly? Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on now. Molly, I need your help here. Can you share the poll so that I can see it as well? I haven't got that. I'm going to actually just move on from that and hope that I work this out. But my aim for this poll was to get some feel for the audience and to see how many of you are actually directly involved in safeguarding and how many of you are, if you like, involved with, okay, I'm beginning to see here that we've got 24% of people are governors and trustees, 33% are safeguarding the actual named person, and 35% of you are the chair, some of whom, of course, might be both those. So it's probably 8% clerks. That's really interesting. Good to see you on here, clerks and governance professionals. And welcome to the session. Right, okay, I'm going to shift now. Safeguarding the governance challenge. I've called it a challenge because I think that those of you who have been governing and either governors or trustees for a while, or even those of you who are new to it and are beginning to realise the challenges of the role, there are some things which all of us dread, and a failure of safeguarding, a failure to keep children safe is one of those things. It makes the headlines. It's it's bad news for, obviously, for the child, but it's also bad news for the organisation. And because it's so important that we get it right, there are certain guidelines that we have to comply with when we're doing our job, we're carrying out our role. So that compliance aspect of safeguarding is important, but the other thing that's really important is culture. We know what to do in terms of compliance by reading the guidance, and keeping children safe in education is the key document for us all. Interestingly, it's 119 pages with only 4 mentions of culture, but we're inspected to see how well we do that by Ofsted. And interestingly enough, Ofsted's document is only 39 pages, but makes 10 mentions of culture. And in fact, if you look at their guidance, you actually read what it says in there, it makes absolutely clear that governors and trustees must promote and ensure that their organisations create positive culture and ethos. And I don't think there's anything in there that any of us would disagree with in terms of being part of the everyday life of our school or trust, that we must be vigilant, that we must listen, and we must respond. The way that we do that is basically the scaffolding, the framework is in our policies. And our policies, a lot of schools and trusts will have an overarching policy which will talk about all the policies that are linked to safeguarding, but the anchor to it all will be that child protection policy, which we all have to review every year. Our policies should reflect our values. So they don't just say what we do, but they say how we do it. So and that's why the values part comes in here, because it should be, that we do things in certain ways. Our policies must be up to date. They've got to reflect all national and local guidance. It's helpful as well if good practice sort of threads through those policies and those procedures, so that everybody is aware of expectations. And they must be understood through training, updates, monitoring, evaluation, and necessary reviewing when things aren't working quite as well as they should be. And the theory is then that if you've got all your policies in place and those policies are complied with in line with your values, then you will create a good safeguarding environment and culture in which children and staff are working in your organisation. I'm putting a question mark there because policies sort of seem to live in drawers or filing cabinets or whatever, and sometimes they only come out when things go wrong, whereas actually, especially with an area as important as safeguarding, where there are compliance issues as well as process issues, it's absolutely critical that they are living documents and everybody is aware of them and where they are and how they work. One of the things that policy should talk about is risk, and any board at the moment will be probably overdosed on risk management, but the whole notion of re-evaluating risk in terms of safeguarding because of the pandemic, most, if not all, schools and trusts will have been through that exercise. There are more unknowns at the moment with the pandemic, though we've had to amend policy and there is greater exposure to risk. So the likelihood of a safeguarding failure is higher. The impact of any failure is always great, but with impact on the organisation and the individual, obviously. But at the moment, because of the uncertainties that we're living through, then obviously they're going to be amplified. And the result is, of course, that when we're thinking about severity, we might want to up. When we're scoring our risk, we'll probably up that severity and actually think more carefully about controls that we need to put in place to minimise the risk. So moving on from that, to what you need to know in usual times. And for those of us who've been governing for some time, these documents are fairly standard stuff. We're used to keeping children safe in education. Many of us also have looked at working together to safeguard children, and NGA has its own safeguarding guidance, which points out what particular bits of these things you need to know about. Is helpful to know. However, and I suppose just to summarise that what our core task is to protect children from maltreatment, to prevent impairment of their health, both physical, mental, their developmental health as well, but also to ensure that they grow up in happy circumstances and safe circumstances as possible, and most importantly, that we take action when necessary. But we're not in normal times at the moment, and we have had all been very tested on many fronts by the pandemic. And so quickly, poll number 2 for you. Molly, can you launch that for me, please? And this poll is just asking whether you have been more or less concerned about safeguarding during the pandemic. Right, Molly, I'm going to ask you to put to me again like you did last time, because one of the things we didn't practice was how I can see the poll results at the same time, so that I can get okay, so 36% of you have found yourselves more concerned about safeguarding. Really good to see that nearly 60% have felt confident their schools are dealing with this well. It's what I would expect. Schools have been absolutely amazing with dealing with the challenges of the pandemic, and have had to get their heads around an enormous amount of guidance which has come out at unhelpful times and in unhelpful ways. You know, when it's been updated, we haven't been made aware of where the updates have changed and things like that. So most of us have spent some time supporting our heads and chief execs as they've been attempting to navigate their way around this guidance. But that guidance has come out from the DfE, and some of us will be familiar with it as well. Many of you will have seen the guidance that we produced about safeguarding during the pandemic, and I hope you found that useful. You'll also have had guidance from your local authorities or your trusts. I discovered the Southwest Grid for Learning, which has had some great resources on it. I was signposted to it by Andrew Hall's safeguarding briefing, which comes out every week. Arrives in inbox. I think it's at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning. So talk about getting the week off to a good start, but incredibly useful touchstone for what we need to be aware of. And it's mainly aimed at the operational side of things, but it's very useful as background, and it's short as well. So we've all needed to get to know a lot, but I'm just going to leave this here for a moment for you to look at about the paradox. We use this slide quite a lot about the paradox of what you need to know. So although an awful lot of what's been going on in schools could be deemed to be operational, for us to be able to test whether what is happening to the required standard, is we need to know a little bit about what they're doing. And because everybody's been learning very rapidly, we've probably been learning at the same pace and about the same things. Well, I think many of us have anyway, about the challenges that have arisen for schools in terms of safeguarding over the last year or so. And so with the pandemic, we have new considerations that we've had to take into account. We have had to change policies. Most schools and trusts decided the easiest way to do this was to add an annex to existing policies. Now that schools are back, do we take that annex off? Do we leave it there for reference in future? Those are considerations. But within school, it was absolutely critical that everyone working from home was still aware of how to contact their designated safeguarding lead, the DSL, and that what processes were in place to make people aware of if that person was sick, who took over, and the same for senior leaders, and the same for who was going to inform social services and things like that. So all those processes that needed to be changed because people were not in the same building, seeing each other every day and working in the same way, have been an enormous challenge to schools. And I think most of us, so it's really great to see that those people are confident that these things are happening well. But there have been some specific challenges associated with remote learning. Many of them I'm sure you'll be aware of, that we have got to still ensure the safety of our children and our families. There's particular concerns about online safety. If you're not seeing people every day, how do you know about their well-being? There are issues with data management, especially with the amount of stuff that is happening online at the moment. And there's that thorny issue as well about behaviour and attitudes, because for many teachers, they've got to grapple with students who are working remotely and what happens if they're not behaving as should be expected, and yet they're just a face on a screen. But it's more than that, because actually schools have had to make decisions about whether to have, when they're doing live lessons, whether to have cameras on or off. This logo in the middle of the bird, that's the Liverpool Echo, had parents writing into them because they could see into a classroom. There was a live broadcast from a classroom, and they could identify children in that classroom, and they were taking umbrage because they thought those children should not be in school, that they were not children of key workers, but of course children who were deemed to be vulnerable could be in school, and that's an issue of privacy. So that blew up there, but in fact teachers themselves want cameras on because they can engage better with their pupils, so we've got to be able to do that safely. So it's about sorting out backgrounds and things like that. There are also issues about recordings, and when interactions with children on Teams or Zoom or whatever platform you're using, does your school have policies and procedures about that to make sure that children are being kept safe and confidential information is kept confidential. And of course there's the whole issue of schools being awash with volunteers, in order to, especially schools which are doing testing, and that the whole nature of risk assessing volunteer working in such short timescales has been a real challenge, but it's been amazing to see how most schools are doing this really well. But for us, how do we know what's going on? We are having to monitor remotely. We're not going into school. We're aware of these issues. We have still got to make sure that our schools are undertaking their safeguarding duties well. There are very clear, anyone who's aware of NGA's stance on these things, very clear guidelines on who does what. Obviously, we as board members, governors, trustees agree the policies, make sure there's the right person named to be the named safeguarding governor or trustee, and we might hopefully be determining auditing and reporting arrangements and appetite for risk, whereas the senior leaders are managing the operation, making sure policies are followed, and creating and modelling that safeguarding culture, and of course reporting to us. And then of course there's the named safeguarding person who will be building their knowledge, a particular knowledge of how safeguarding works in the organisation. All of us, though, should have an overview of what happens and how it happens. And these general safeguarding questions, you can find them in our guidance, and it's that understanding of the length and breadth of what schools are doing to make sure our children are safe and to build a picture of it is critical in our role. But the safeguarding governor trustee has more particular role. I mean, although they're appointed, they're not personally responsible for anything. It's also corporate, but there is an expectation that in their strategic overview role that they will, and I've gone back, they will build relationships with key people in the school or trust, and they'll build a bank of knowledge as well. It's very useful for somebody to see some anonymized case studies of what happens, for example, when a child discloses something, and the journey that is taken to ensure that that if there is any necessary intervention, that it happens, so that we can really understand what schools do in these sorts of unfortunate situations. And visiting shouldn't be any more than termly, and the purpose of any visit should be clear. There's a role description available for NGA members, and I hope that is helpful in framing the length and breadth of the role. There would be an expectation that the safeguarding governor or trustee will have this basic knowledge and would be able to talk about these aspects of safeguarding within the school or the trust. Auditing and reporting. Auditing safeguarding is a skilled job, and it requires safeguarding. There's a lot to know. There's a lot to check up on how actually safeguarding works within the school or trust, how policies are followed, how issues are dealt with, and it's not. Our view is it's not something for amateurs. That's something that schools and trusts should be prepared to invest in. If your school is part of a multi-academy trust, you are a trustee of a multi-academy trust, increasingly we're seeing that trusts are investing in trust-wide safeguarding expertise, and will have a lead person who can support all the schools in that trust with their safeguarding responsibilities, which is really good to see. But it's also interesting that in multi-academy trust, the role of the local governing body or academy council, they're the eyes and ears of what's going on within that school. And so anyone who has that role with locally, so if you're a governor of a maintained school or you're on a local governing body, okay, there's a certain amount of auditing for compliance which needs to be done, but your perceptions of the culture of the school, does it feel safe when you enter there? What are the signing in arrangements? If you're walking around, have you got a lanyard with a different colour ribbon so people know that you're there in a certain capacity? Have you ever been challenged walking around the school? Have you chatted to some pupils or some staff and talked about, open questions? Do you feel safe at school? Who do you go to if you had a worry? Are you aware of avenues for help? Those things can be really, really revealing, but also incredibly reassuring as well. So everybody has a responsibility to build some general awareness. But there is the issue of the single central record. Our view for a while has been that it's not a job for governors and trustees, it's a skills job. And that's the ideal is if an expert does it and reports that the single central record is compliant, and Amanda Strom and the Majesty's Chief Inspector agreed with that. However, we are pragmatic, and we know that in some cases it is this isn't an option, and that governors and trustees are still doing it. So poll number 3, quick poll, again, another quick poll, just to find out those of you who are auditing your single central record and those of you who are leaving it to someone else, be really interested to get the results on that. Give us a straw poll of how that's working. In my own trust, we've just asked HR experts to look at our single central record. They reported back that not only was it compliant, but it had some extra features on it, which made which evidenced best practice. It was really, it felt like money well spent, that, because it was a really good assurance. Interestingly, 65% of you are still carrying out that auditing, and only 12% getting an expert to do it, which is useful for us to know. 14% don't know who's doing it, so maybe there's something to be learned from that. Okay, if you are doing it and you're doing it remotely, there are some sensible questions that you can ask. If you get the answers to these questions, you won't be able to sit next to the person who manages your single central record in the office, as you would probably normally do with a screen open. But if you, and you shouldn't be sharing screens on this because it's confidential information, but you can ask questions such as the questions here. You will have access to this this presentation after it's finished, so you'll be able to pick up these questions. I'm not going to read them out now, but there are sensible questions which get the answers, report them to your next meeting. They'll then be in meeting papers and minutes, and you will have a record. Right, moving on to the back to school bit, and I found this photo which I just thought was absolutely wonderful. Thank you to The Guardian for your expert photography, but the excitement, my road is on a walk to school route, and the chatter from the children was fantastic. It was also a bit disappointing to see all the traffic that's back on the roads, but it's been lovely to see the kids chatting and joshing. But the questions for us all now are: what about the impact? What is the impact of lockdown? And interestingly enough, as I was putting the final touches to this, I was listening to Dame Rachel D'Souza, who is the new Children's Commissioner, and there's a picture of her there, a bit of a darling of the government. She was Chief Exec of the Inspiration Trust, which is a very successful multi-academy trust in the East of England. But she was talking actually it was good to hear her talking about that we have got to get to grips now with, for some kids, obviously, it will not have had a profound impact. For some of them, they'll have enjoyed it, they'll have worked well, but for others, depending on their age group, their circumstances, and what has happened to them if they have become bereaved or become young carers, what that will mean to them in terms of recovering from this pandemic. There are additional considerations that schools will be looking at, hopefully they'll be looking at anyway. There's been an awful lot of time spent online, which for many children will have been unmoderated, and this might lead to well-being issues which schools will need to be aware of. And of course there are issues about safeguarding staff, and throughout all of this, which we should have been aware of all along, and hopefully will continue to be. And it's not over yet. With the second spike that we had, as indicated here, was gruesome, and I don't think any of us could have thought it would be that bad. There are mutterings about a third spike. Let's hope that with vaccination and the number of people that have had it already, that does not come to reality. However, those long-term effects of which are going to, interestingly enough, one of the things that I was reading about is that, oh, I've walked forward again, is that children have come back to school very excited and very high. In 2 or 3 weeks' time, they're expecting issues to start coming out as children relax back into routines, and there is an expectation that concerns, worries, well-being will reveal themselves in 2 or 3 weeks' time. We've got the Easter holiday, which will be an interruption, but it seems that the schools are well aware of this. But in terms of tracking referrals, tracking issues with well-being, it will be up to us to watch this to see if it is actually happening and if that has an effect on staff as well, because of course it's distressing for them having to deal with children who are not getting, not having the time of their lives. We should have contingency backup plans in case things get bad again, also because there will be schools sending loads of children home on because they've been in contact and having to self-isolate. I had a very disappointing story today of one school which is basically half the children are at home again because of the results of testing. And then we are at least a year down the line in a much better place to use what we've learned in terms of supporting pupils and families. And there is going to be consideration about how we can learn to use online learning better and for how long. So this is sort of the end point, really, of what we need to be asking of our schools and trusts as we move into return to normality. What are our attendance figures telling us about the return to school? Has there been an increase in referrals and types of referrals? What additional support are we offering or signposting? And do we know if it's been taken up? Because that's important. Is the culture right? Do children and young people feel safe enough to take up the support? They don't. If there's any notion of stigma, they won't. What are our surveys telling us, and are our risk assessments in order in case things kick off again? I think I'm going to end now with a super cheesy slide. Safeguarding should be, and for I think every school I've come across, it's at the heart of all our schools. I did some work, some of you will know that I did some work in India a year or so ago, talking to them about safeguarding. The school there had head teachers from English schools, and getting them to talk about what they did in terms of safeguarding made me, and the trustees there, who this was all news to them, they didn't realise that it was all going on in the background because they don't have to report it in the same way, they don't have the same expectations. It made me proud that actually here in England we have such fantastic safeguarding controls, concerns and methods of dealing with it in our schools, and that is a place where children can feel safe. So we need to know what we need to know. We need to know our role, keep up to date, ask questions, listen, and always respond. And on that note, thank you for attending. I haven't managed to look at the chat because I did talk too much and too quickly, but good luck with your schools being back, and I hope that the number of referrals or whatever, it isn't bad, and that actually we get through this in the best possible way. Thank you. Goodbye.